Well, basically, I'm here today. I'm Pete's brother, and I've watched what he's done over the years from that a good vantage point because I've got continuity. I don't have a snapshot of him. I've got a long-running interaction with him, and when he first got started putting to print his thoughts, which he had been developing over many previous years, when he had finished doing the research, when he was one of the first people to search the newly digitized code. He was one of the first people to say, hey, there's now 3.5 million words I can search. It was, I think, the year 2000 or something. And he went in and he started searching for keywords. When he began turning up the results that you see in his book, I said, you know, Pete, that's very interesting. I don't have the time to dissect what your thesis is. I don't have time to cross-check it against, anything else related. So I said, come back to me maybe after a few years and after a few dozen people have successfully used it, because I just didn't have time to be bothered. But I'm interested from the sidelines. Well, now it's multi-years later, and he has many hundreds and hundreds and thousands. The hundreds and thousands are known. The tens of thousands are not known to us, but they no doubt exist because the ordinary person receiving a refund is not going to send their name and the picture of their refund check into a third party like Pete, unless something really, it's a much bigger movement than meets the eye. So I suspect there's a big number, and who knows what that is. But what's on in print, what's been forwarded to him is considerable. And he's not an author of just one book. He's an author of more than one book. And another one that I have on my shelf is titled "Upholding the Law." That's Pete. Pete is a thoroughgoing law upholder, and he is a strict logician. He is someone who pretty much builds if he's going to build a house around a concept, it'll be a brick house. It's not made out of straw. He has everything covered. And when I looked deeper and deeper into his claims on this one matter about upholding the law, the tax law, again, he has essays on 25 or 30 different other elements of the law that are breathtakingly, they're spectacular forays into clear-headed thinking. But in this one area on taxes, I kept expecting at some point I would find on my own reconnaissance. I thought I would be sure to find something that would run contrary, and to this day I have not found anything. All I found is repeated confirmations, repeated buttressing, and on the other side, on the IRS side, there is nothing. They cite no Supreme Court law. They cite ludicrous, misdirectional district court precedent in their favor. They have nothing to go on. They have calumny, they have insult, and they have power. There are a couple things that I know from my own research that run parallel to what Pete has done. And here's what I know about the period after 1913, when the income tax amendment was passed. I know that between 1913 and 1941, a maximum, in any given year, there's a maximum number of Americans that paid income tax during that entire generation leading into World War II. 28 years, 29 years continuous. No more than 8% of the public, and an average of more like 5% of the public, ever filed or paid an income tax return. In any given year, at the height of the Depression, when the government really needed money, it maxed out at 8%. The year of Pearl Harbor, 1941, again, 8%. That's it. And that bears a very strong relation to Pete's claim that only those holding a privilege under the federal government are obligated to pay the tax. State governments agreed that their employees should also pay the tax. They voluntarily agreed. There's statutory authority for them to collect income tax. And 8% is approximately the level of the population during all those years preceding Pearl Harbor that paid income tax or filed a return. It's rather curious. It must mean that the other 92% of all of our grandparents and great-grandparents were tax cheaters or morons. They couldn't even understand their obligation to file a return, you see? Now, how could that be that 92, I guess they were just all morons, or worse, they were cheaters. It's plain as day. Now, this is something that I happened on as I looked through some statistics at Pete's request. He was trying to find some statistical material, and I happened to find a mother lode in the congressional record, and I said, my God, what's going on here? Well, then there's another little related element that comes into the picture in 1942. The year after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. government completes a year, in 1941, where only 8% pay. And so in 1942, they employed the Walt Disney Company to do a theater short, a cartoon short starring Donald Duck, in order to urge Americans to file and pay income tax. They ran that, they spent $80,000, which was a princely sum in today's dollars, today's devalued currency that the government also, unfortunately, is manipulating. Down, down, down. Well, $80,000 was a princely sum in those days, and they rushed this thing into all the theaters. And there was Donald Duck having an argument with his radio. The radio was saying, "There's a war going on. You must." It's talking to him. You know, you have to pay. Come on. All Americans should pay a tax, and you should be one of those guys too. You should send in your bacon fat to the war effort. Send in your recycled aluminum, tinfoil, and your automotive tires. Don't buy tires for your car. And please send in tax. So they're urging Donald Duck, and of course, for 18 out of the 20 minutes, he's resisting, as Donald Duck always does. Resisting good sense, and finally he agrees. Yeah, I think I will. And look, the radio is making it easy for me to fill out my form. Well, he sends in his tax, and he's so happy. And at the end, of course, there's this call to arms, something like taxes to beat the Axis, something like that. Very militant, militaristic type of tone to it. And I studied this. I learned what happened with that same congressional record. I learned that in that year, 1942, at the height of World War II, with the nation in the greatest danger ever from Hitler and Tojo and so forth, 1942, when the war was by no means won, when Hitler was triumphant and Japan ruled all of East Asia, at that point, income tax filings went up from 8% all the way up to 38%. All the way up to 38%. In other words, still a decided minority. Now, this tells me something. When you have to use a Donald Duck short to convince Americans, then maybe Pete's got a point that those who voluntarily send money into the government will accept it. But those who discover that they're not obligated to do so, those people who pay sales taxes, pay property taxes, pay any kind of tax to which they know they're legally obligated, but find that this tax they are not legally obligated to pay, this out of all the taxes that they do pay, maybe he's got a point. Pete is a taxpayer. He pays any tax that he is legally entitled to pay. And so this is another fascinating thing that I learned. I'm going to supplement that with a couple more things. The IRS doesn't want to hear that there is a definition for the word income. There's a definition for the word wages, and that you are taxable on the income that you earn from, that's in quotations, a defined term in the statute is income. The income that you earn on defined term, quote unquote, wages. These are common usage terms, but in the statute, if a term is defined, then that term takes on the definition that the statute gives it, not the ordinary definition. And Pete realized that income and wages and many other terms are defined, and therefore he searched the code and he found out what those definitions meant, and they didn't apply to him or you or me. Well, so in that context, we have an IRS which is demanding that its understanding of the term wages and income and this stuff should all be taxed. It's that only its definition applies, and they are just so much more knowledgeable than you and me. They're so much more educated than you and me, and they have so much more power than you, and you'd better listen. Well, this same IRS lost in every court that they were exposed to. They lost on a word definition, a simple word definition. They lost on a definition relating to the telephone excise tax that they had been collecting illicitly ever since the Spanish-American War. In that Spanish-American War, a tax was passed to support that war effort in 1898. A 2-year tax, which then got just extended by default. They just kept collecting it. And that was a tax on telephone calls. The newfangled telephone in the year 1898 was a luxury. And they made a tax to support the war effort. And the tax was based on, they could do an excise tax on telephonic traffic that was wherever the telephone company charged based on distance rings and elapsed time of the call. I'm making a long-distance call to California from Michigan. That's a distance ring. It's cheaper if you call inside Michigan, it's more expensive if you call to Ohio, and even more expensive if you call to California. And they were allowed to collect an excise tax if you recall lasted 40 seconds, not 30 seconds, and if it was based on distance rings. Well, some high-powered lawyers working for very rich U.S. corporations realized in about the year 2002 that they were illicitly collecting this tax because there are no more distance rings. Uniformly across the country, AT&T charges the same rate whether you call California or down the street. It's basically, if the phone call lasts for some time, then they charge for that. But the IRS resisted and resisted. They won in some district courts because the judges were pushovers for the IRS. They sucked up to power, and they took the IRS's statement whole. But other district courts said, no, these people are screwed up. And then they went to appeal, and they lost in every circuit court of appeals in the country. They lost 6 out of 6. And these circuit courts of appeals said, you know, you can't mangle the definition of the word and to mean and or. And means and. And they laughed the IRS out of their courtrooms, and the IRS lost every case. Because the IRS was saying, we get to charge this excise tax if there's a distance ring-based calculation and or if there's an elapsed time calculation. So we're going to keep collecting that tax on all your cell phone calls, even if there's no distance rings. And these judges correctly said, you are jerks, and means and. You have to have both conditions, not one or the other. And the IRS was thrown out in 6 out of 6 because their definition, their self-justifying, self-aggrandizing definition was ludicrously, plainly wrong, self-serving, and wrong. And they then refunded years worth of this tax to the taxpayer in the year 2006. This is who Pete is up against. This is an agency that can't even get the word and right because they're self-serving. They want your money. And the illegal collections that they took over those 109 years since the Spanish-American War, if you put it in today's dollars, is $1 trillion that they took in from the American taxpayer illegally by mangling plain definitions. And that's what Pete is saying. He's saying, I've read the definitions. The word income is a defined term, and it doesn't apply to most of us. The same thing with the word wages, the same thing with the word employer. And so when I get a W-2 from someone saying that I earned taxable wages from when my employer sends something like that into me. Okay. Pete doesn't take that and just swallow it. He says, I'm going to look up what the word wages means. And when he reads it, he says, I'm going to file a correction to my W-2. And he's allowed to do so. And the IRS plainly doesn't like this. That's Pete's case. Pete wants these people to come out of their fortress and talk about simple definitions that are simply on the books. And that's what I hope will happen. I hope that this nation of sheeple gets a little bit of stiffened spine.